what's your opinion on the application and viability of new theories like modern monetary theory?
Yeah. Okay. So let's think about this for a minute. Modern monetary theory, what it says is basically, and I'm going to simplify it, is that there's no trouble printing money. That money money gets its value from the fact that you need it to pay taxes, and therefore the government can print as much as it wants to pay for whatever it wants. The bottom line being, we don't need to worry about deficits and debts. We just print more money. And kind of mainstream economists will come back and say, well, but you do that, you're going to create inflation. To which the monetarists will say, and again, I'm simplifying this, generally speaking, the MMT people will say, yeah, well, it's possible you may get some inflation, but if you do, you can simply raise taxes, which will siphon this excess money out of the economy to keep your prices stable. So the picture you should have in your mind is, on the one hand, the government's printing money and spending it for things it wants. And on the other hand, as we get too much money, it starts to create inflationary pressures. The government taxes to pull that money out of the system, and that stabilizes prices. So that's the general idea. Now, what the problem with this is, what nobody's saying, or at least the MMTers aren't saying, is that what you've done at the end is to substitute goods and services that people want for goods and services that politicians want. So what you're really doing is taking money out of the hands of people, putting it into the hands of politicians. And so at the end of the day, let's suppose you end up with the same GDP as you had before, gross domestic product. We had $20 trillion before, we have $20 trillion now, except that masks what constitutes that GDP. So what would have been the case is you had $20 trillion worth of GDP, and what was that GDP? Well, it was things that people want, cars and houses and clothes and computers and these sorts of things. And now you have $20 trillion worth of GDP, but what constitutes that GDP? It's more things like roads, bridges, tanks, border walls, all sorts of things that government wants. And so when you're done, although the numbers economically look about the same, we've got the same GDP after as before, people aren't as happy. And so it, you ask, is this kind of thing, sustainable? I would say no, because what you're doing ultimately is making people progressively less and less happy by taking away their ability to decide for themselves what goods and services they'll have.
Okay, and that actually answered two of my other questions, but I'm going to pivot off that issue, and I'm going to refer to 2009, where the former Fed chair, Ben Bernanke, he was interviewed on 60 Minutes, and he was asked about the $1 trillion bailout that they did in 2009, and he was asked whether that money came from taxpayers or whether it was printed, and he said the money was printed. And so following that bailout of the banking system in 2009, where the government didn't tax taxpayers, but rather printed that money, the United States didn't experience a significant increase in inflation. And so does the economic viability of that theory that inflation rises with the printing of money still stand if there's historical evidence like we saw in 2008?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the fact is, we did experience inflation, it just didn't show up in the numbers. And here's what I mean by that. When we say inflation, what people mean is the growth rate in consumer prices. Mm-hmm. And what economists will do is they'll look at things that people buy, cars, refrigerators, new carpeting for your house, whatever it is, and observe those prices over time. If the prices start to go up on average, we say this is inflation. Now, there are things that aren't included in that list of things that we look at when we look at prices. And one of the important things that's not included are financial instruments, stocks, bonds, these sorts of things. And so if the if we have an influx of money into the system, it's possible, and this is what I claim happened post 2008, that money that's injected into the system did not go into the market for goods and services. It went largely into the market for financial assets. And so what you get is in I'll use the word inflation. You get inflation in the financial markets, but not in the goods and services markets. And what does that look like? What it looks like is rising stock prices. So stock markets up, falling bond yields, because bond yields move in the opposite direction of bond prices. So if bond prices are going up, bond yields are going down. So we've got improving stock market, we've got lower interest rates on bonds, and people look at that and they say, hey, that's a great thing, because my retirement fund is worth more now because stock prices are higher. I can borrow money at a lower interest rate because bond prices are higher, interest rates are lower. And what we're not realizing is that that's the inflation. We just aren't calling it inflation because it's not occurring in the market for goods and services. Now, eventually, it's going to come into the markets for goods and services. Why? Because why do you hold financial assets? The reason you hold financial assets is because eventually you want to sell those financial assets and buy things that you want, cars and houses and whatever it is. And so eventually that money that's been thrown into the financial markets will eventually come out into the market for goods and services. And when it does, then you'll start to see it in the official numbers. So the short answer, to follow my long answer, is we did get inflation. We just aren't counting it because it's occurring in the financial markets rather than the goods and services markets.
Okay. And thank you for that answer. I'm going to focus on another aspect of what modern monetary theory focuses on and what advocates of the theory push. And they believe that significantly higher amounts of government spending that than we do in the status quo, which will, of course, result in higher national deficits for the United States. But they believe that will increase job opportunity and economic wealth for the United States. And so my question is, what is your opinion on the economic impact of, for example, increased government monetary support for businesses such as government bailouts?
Yeah, this is, if you think about cartoons, invariably you'll see a cartoon at some point that has somebody in a sailboat, and the guy, the cartoon character, wants a sailboat to go. So what's he do? He grabs a fan and plugs it in and aims it at the sail, and the sailboat goes off, right? And of course, that's complete nonsense because the physics doesn't work that way. The force, the air that comes out of the fan that hits the sail, the forward motion, the forward pressure on the sail is exactly counterbalanced by the backward motion on the fan. So the way the physics works is the boat doesn't go anywhere. And that's that same thought process is going on here when we say, well, the government should spend more money and it will increase economic activity. And so we'll have more jobs and everything's going to be better. That's the guy sitting in the boat with the fan aiming at its sail and expecting the boat to move. And the way you have to think about this is to remember that every dollar the government spends has to come from somewhere. And it can only come from a few places. One is taxes, that the government taxes people to be able to have the money that it's going to spend. The other is borrowing, that it borrows the money from whom? From the people, so it now has this money to spend. The third is that it prints the money, and so it has money to spend, but printing the money has economically the exact same effect as if the government taxed people's savings. And so again, it's the government taking money, not taking physical money, but taking purchasing power away from people so that it can spend it. And what you end up with is not a situation in which the government has spent money and therefore pushed the economy forward. Instead, you have a situation where the government has spent money pushed the economy forward today in exchange for pulling it back tomorrow. And the tomorrow part is the impact of the government having raised taxes or borrowed from people or printed the money. So when you're done, all government spending does is to shift economic activity from the future to the present. It does not create economic activity that wouldn't otherwise have existed.
Would you hold that same philosophy true for example, stimulus checks that we saw sent out a few months ago?
Yeah, very much so. And I'm not arguing here that we shouldn't have done it. What I'm arguing is to understand what it is we actually did. With the stimulus checks, what we did was to take purchasing power, to take economic activity from the future and to apply it today. Now, I think with everything that was going on with the lockdowns and COVID, that might not have been a bad idea. I think of the various things that we could have done, that would have probably been, amongst my top 5 for, advice. This is a good thing. But understand, we aren't creating economic activity out of thin air. We have to pay that bill. And when we pay that bill, we will see the economy shrink by the same amount that it's grown now. Now, the hope, of course, is that when we have to pay that bill for the stimulus that we've spent now, that the economy will be in a stronger position so we can afford to pay it. And if you think about it, this is what people do all the time. You're going to be going off to college pretty soon. And when you do, you'll be doing the exact same thing that the government is doing now. You'll be taking a student loan that enables you to pay for college today in exchange for paying back that loan in the future. But the future you who's going to be paying back that loan will be some guy who's got a degree and is able to earn much more money and this sort of thing. You'll be in a position later on to be able to afford to pay that loan that you aren't in a position to do now. And so we say, yeah, this is a good idea. You should do this. So too with the government. My only warning is don't think this is some magic wand. What we're doing is taking from the future to spend now.
Okay, and I'm gonna go off something that you brought up with significantly higher federal deficits. Governments must pay for it with higher taxes. And so I know that you've spent a lot of time in your Learn Liberty videos and your podcast discussing the national deficit. And you state that we can reduce the federal deficit by having increasing economic growth to catch up to the current federal deficit levels by around 2050. And so I'm going to use Japan as a historical example, which runs a deficit percentage of 240% of GDP, and it experienced, I think, negative 0.3% inflation in March of 2020. And so if high federal deficits in Japan, for example, didn't increase inflation rates, what's the economic basis for maintaining balanced budgets?
Yeah, I don't know the particulars about Japan, so there's not much intelligent I can say there. The I think what we're talking about here in the video, my point was we can get out of the problem we have now with relatively little pain, not zero pain, but relatively little pain, by allowing the economy to catch up to the size of government. And the way you do that is you hold the government spending constant, or it's not as good, but you can do this as well. Let government spending grow, but make sure it grows at a slower pace than the economy grows. And what happens is over time, your economy will grow enough that you now have an economy capable of supporting the government that you have in place. And this has been the case in the United States for many years now. I should say more than years, decades now, that consistently our government is about 6 years ahead of our economy. That is, the government we have today will be able to afford 6 years from now. And what we can afford today is the government we had 6 years ago.
And I what I was really trying to ask is, I'll use Europe as an example. That there's 19 European countries who have much higher deficit rates as compared to GDP. And so really my question is, what's wrong with maintaining high federal deficits? And I think I understand it, but I think a lot of people who are listening don't really get that.
Yeah, the 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 problem with the deficit is every deficit you had adds to your debt. So think about water filling up a bathtub. The water coming out of the faucet, that's the deficit. The level of the water in the bathtub, that's the debt. So every year you have a deficit, it just adds more and more on to the debt. Now, there's good news and bad news here. The good news is you don't have to pay off the debt. like an individual who has a credit card doesn't have to pay off the credit card every month. All you have to do is be able to make the minimum monthly payments. You can make the minimum monthly payments. That's fine. You just go on with life. So too the government. The government doesn't need to pay off its debt, but it does have to, the term we use is service. It does have to service its debt. And to service the debt means to be able to make the monthly or quarterly, whatever it is, interest payments. So here we are in the United States with $27 trillion in debt. The current interest rate the government pays is 2.5%. So that means it costs our federal government almost $700 billion a year just to pay the interest on the debt. The bigger that debt gets, the bigger the interest payments become. And that 700 billion, that's money the government could afford, right? But it's money that could otherwise have been used for other things. You talk about having more money available for public education or building infrastructure, bridges and roads, or funding the police, or whatever it is you want to do. There's all sorts of things we could have done that we aren't doing because we've got to put $700 billion a year toward the debt. The bigger the debt becomes, the more money we have to put aside for that. So in that sense, you can have a larger debt. The question is, can you afford the interest payments? Now, part of the problem we have currently in this country is that although we've got these payments, and they're 700 billion, the federal government brings in annually somewhere around $3.75 trillion in tax revenue. So it's bringing in more than it has to pay in interest. However, that's it. That's when interest rates are 2.5%. Interest rates are historically low. If interest rates start to rise back to their historical average, all of a sudden the federal government's going to find itself with annual interest payments in the $2 trillion range. That's something it can't afford. And so we got this weird situation now of the federal government can't allow interest rates to rise because it can't afford the servicing of the debt that's going to follow from that.
Okay. My next topic, I'm gonna go off what you just brought up about interest payments. And so we've seen about 19 European countries implement negative interest rates, and classical economics, it would suggest that inflation were to rise following that. But we didn't see that in any of those European nations that implemented it. And similarly, we didn't see inflation directly rise in 2008 and 2009. And so what is your opinion on implementing negative interest rates in the United States?
Yeah, and again, I think we did see it. We saw it in financial markets that the financial markets started rising. In fact, if you look back at news reports in April and May, you'll see a lot of analysts asking the question, how can it be that we're in lockdown and the economy is shrinking, we've got record unemployment, and yet the stock market's going up? And they're wondering how this could possibly be going on. And economists are saying, well, what you're seeing is the inflation. You are getting the inflation. We just aren't counting it because it's in financial markets. The reason the stock market is high, it's high artificially because we pumped all this money into there. So I think that's what's going on. It's not that you're getting negative interest rates with no inflation. You're getting negative interest rates with tremendous inflation. We just aren't counting it.
Okay. And so really what I'm trying to get out here is what the root cause of inflation is. And so I'm going to discuss two examples. And I know in macroeconomics, everyone learns about the collapse of the Zimbabwe economy in the late 1990s and the 2000s when Mugabe, he printed trillions of Zimbabwe dollars and he ruined the agricultural production. And similarly in the Weimar Republic, when the German government printed billions of dollars to pay for its bills. And so my question is, which is really the key question to this new economic theory, is the lack of goods, labor, and the lack of production capacity the reason for inflation, or is the reason for inflation the printing of excessive amounts of money?
Yeah, some economists for whom I have tremendous respect say that inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. And what they mean by that is if you're getting inflation, it's because you have grown the money supply. I get the statement. I respectfully submit that it isn't entirely correct, that you can get inflation without increasing the money supply if the economy shrinks. So something comes along like we have with COVID, the lockdown, that causes the economy to now produce a lot less. And what's going on here? Your question started off with what is the root of inflation? Put in your mind a fraction, and on the numerator of this fraction is the money supply. In the denominator of the fraction is the amount of goods and services we produce. That fraction represents the average price level. If the fraction gets bigger, that's inflation. If the fraction gets smaller, that's deflation. So think about inflation, the fraction getting bigger. There's two ways this fraction can get bigger. One is that the numerator, the money supply, grows faster than the denominator, the amount of goods and services we produce. The other way this fraction can get bigger, we can get inflation, is if the denominator shrinks. So we have some certain money supply and the economy, for whatever reason, shrinks, and now your ratio of dollars to goods and services has gone up. That gives you inflation. And so what you're seeing here is when we think about prices and inflation, what we're really talking about is what happens to the amount of goods and services my $20 bill can buy. And what happens to the amount of goods and services my $20 bill can buy depends on two things: how many other $20 bills there are, and how many goods and services are available to be bought.
And I would agree with that. I think it's a mix between excessive printing and just a lack of like productivity, which we can see in pretty much every example. And so my last question is, some politicians, like you referred to, you didn't say him by name, but there's some politicians, Senator Sanders, Representative Cortez, they've advocated for some really controversial policies following this theory, and mainly they've championed policies that they look to achieve full employment in the workforce. And so my question is it possible in our capitalistic society to ever reach what they call full employment?
Yeah, it is. I have to stop and define full employment. Full employment does not mean everybody's working. It means everybody who wants a job is working, minus a small fraction of people who are in the process of switching jobs. So it doesn't mean there's no unemployment, and it varies by, people estimate it differently, but there's the full employment unemployment level is somewhere around, I don't know, 2% or something, 3% something. And what is that? That's a fraction of people who are unemployed, but they're just unemployed temporarily as they're moving from one job to another. We call that situation full employment. Now, here's the thing. If you leave the economy alone, the economy will move toward full employment. And why is that so? Well, if you have a bunch of people out there who are unemployed, it puts downward pressure on prices. Eventually, prices will fall enough that wages will fall enough that it's possible to hire people now more easily than I could hire before. Another way you might think about it is if there's a bunch of people who are unemployed, entrepreneurs will see that as a resource, and they'll think to themselves, what kind of business could I come up with that uses this pool of unemployed people, because I can get them cheaply because they're unemployed, right? And so I'll come up with things, I'll create some new business, and I start to hire these people. So the economy will naturally move toward full employment. What politicians will argue is, well, we need to help it along because the economy is not going to move toward full employment fast enough. And so, some of these people may be unemployed for a long time. Okay. I don't disagree with that statement, but here's my problem with it. It implies that the politicians are able to move faster than the economy. And that tends not to be the case. In fact, if you look back at business cycles, the natural ebb and flow of the economy over time, and you look at government response to that, of we're in a recession, we need to spend more to bring us out of recession type thing. What generally happens is that the economy is already well on the path to correcting itself when the politicians finally get around to doing something. And what happens is they end up, because of these delays in timing, they end up doing the exact opposite of what they should be doing. That the government spending is accelerating when the economy is already growing, and decelerating at times when it's shrinking, which is the exact opposite of what you want to do. There's a good analogy I use for this, which is, imagine that you're driving a car, and I remove the windshield of your car and replace it with a huge television monitor. And the television monitor is tied into a camera that sits on the front of your car. And it shows on this television monitor all the things, everything you would see if there were a windshield in front of you. You see it exactly on the television monitor coming through the camera, except here's the thing. I put a 5-second delay. So what you're seeing on the television monitor is what existed 5 seconds ago. Well, you're going to have cars crashing into each other all over the place because the drivers are reacting to what existed 5 seconds ago, not what exists right now. And that's what happens here when you ask politicians to use government spending to try and nudge us back toward full employment. By the time they get around to doing what they think needs to be done, the economy is already on the path to correction, and they end up doing the exact opposite of what should be done.
And would you correlate policies like using trillions of dollars for green power networks and infrastructure projects to create jobs as a form of what you are referring to?
It's a little bit different, although it's a little bit different, but it is a problem unto itself. When I say something like, okay, we're going to use the stimulus spending and we're going to direct it toward green energy, there's two problems here. The first is the timing that I've already talked about. There's a second problem, which is, how do I, the politician, know that investment in green energy is the best use of these dollars? Maybe a better use of these dollars is investment in restaurants or movie theaters or computers or something else. The fact is, the politician doesn't know what the best use of this money is. Now, if instead you put that money in the hands of people, of consumers, they also don't know what the best use of that money is. However, they have an incentive to figure out what the best use is that the politician doesn't have. And that incentive comes from the fact that you gave them the money. It's my money now. And if I spend it incorrectly, that's painful for me. We say I wasted the money, but if I spend it on something that's good, that actually helps me, then I say, oh, that's a good use of the money. If you give me the consumer the money and let me decide how to spend it, I have a much stronger incentive to spend that money wisely than the politician does, because the politician does not directly feel the pain of making a mistake.